ravens, cats, goats, wolves, seals, snakes, bears, elk, hares and rabbits, eagles, falcons, squirrels, horses. Animals pepper the Eddas and sagas, manifesting in various forms and fulfilling a variety of roles. They are messengers, guides, guardians, sages, explorers, followers, and fighters. Specific animals are strongly associated with specific deities, and in turn with specific realms and spheres. Ravens and wolves with war, boars and horses with fertility, virility, and vitality. At times these animals are apparently deeply sacred, and at times utterly mundane and prosaic. In the former role, it is clear that they held some sort of power or innate associations that were probably very well known among the applicable populations at the time of the Viking Age. A consensus, for example, that offering ravens or raven eggs was customary during a burial to appease Odin, or claim the dead for Odin, or otherwise make the dead's journey to their afterlife swift and without challenge. This is something we see also across history and in times far before the Viking and migration period. Even today in a Christian Western world, we see birds associated with passing, a past soul, and death. What I find particularly interesting is that there is a clear distinction in the modern day between human and animal. As humans, we see ourselves as masters of our environment. Not animal, but something else. Animals are wild things of the wild, of the space we believe we've moved on from, evolved beyond. A millennia ago this was far from the case, though it's clear that the view was starting to form and take shape into what we see today. After all, the old ways are fundamentally tied to nature, to reciprocity with the land, and the new Christian worldview looked up into the heavens rather than down at the earth for inspiration and enlightenment. Post-conversion, the demarcation between animals and humans would only become more concrete and absolute. But in this video, I'm going to be talking about the Viking Age and some of the potential conclusions we can draw as heathens in the modern day. Let's start from the obvious place. The theme of animals to facilitate or help travel. The gods, regardless of their otherworldly abilities, often take the forms of animals or otherwise utilize animals to travel. Odin taking the form of an eagle, Freya or Loki donning a falcon cloak, Thor's chariot being pulled by goats, and so on. They rarely travel across worlds or realms, or from one place to another without this occurring in some capacity. Of course, we do have some instances of travel without animals being involved, but they're most often within the realms of the Jotun or giant kin, like we see when King Hedingus is taken to Hell's realm by a quote giantess. In my belief, as I go on to discuss, there's something of the wild about travel and movement. There's something wistful, something that animals embody that as humans we've lost or were losing 1,000 years ago. Freedom. The ability to act without restraint or social boundaries. The Jotnar are more tied to this realm as primordial beings, resisting the idea of more modern civilization that the Aesir and to a lesser degree the Vanir embody. Personally, I see the Vanir as a tribe of gods that work alongside the wild, while the Aesir seek to dominate or control it. And when they cannot control, they seek to destroy. As they do with Ymir and the Jotnar that resist them, or otherwise fail to bend to their will. On the other side, I find it interesting that, to take Thor as a key example here, the Aesir are often shown to bind animals to drive their chariots. There's something very controlling in that act. And also that Freya and Frey drive their chariots with cats and Gulimbursti, respectively. This potentially echoes them becoming one of the Aesir in spirit, losing some of their Vanir roots and predilection to connection with the wild and natural things. And then we have Sol and Mani, who drive the sun and moon across the skies in chariots pulled by horses, endlessly pursued by hungry wolves that wish to devour their light. The pattern is quite prominent once you start to look for it, of control versus freedom, of imprisonment and movement, of the wild versus, quote, civilization. Animals then aren't subject to the same restraints that affect our human selves, especially when it comes to freedom of movement. The gods assume the form of raptors or birds, or otherwise use animals to travel fast and across long distances. And moreover, it's interesting that we also see the Aesir, particularly and notably Odin, take on these forms despite the aforementioned resistance to the wild. Because there is something undoubtedly magical and supernatural about the act of taking on an animal form, of shifting your physical shape, and it apparently isn't a typical ability among all of the gods. That would fall in nicely with Odin's practice of magic. He certainly wouldn't sacrifice a potential advantage at the detriment to his status or reputation. After all, magic was not accepted in social settings, at least not entirely. It was othered. Those that practiced it were made pariahs and shunned. Again, we're seeing this idea of breaking social boundaries and the acceptance of the wild and the old and the magical. The supernatural exists, lives, thrives, and flourishes in wild spaces, much to the vexation of the so-called civilized world. Odin, of course, was also the godly master and inspiration overseeing the Hamrammer, the shapeshifters, among humans, tied to the infamous Berserkers and Ulfethnar equally. The act of taking on more animalistic traits put the individual in a place at once very much of a human space and very much not, existing outside of social convention and accepted behaviours, clashing with norms and expectations. Within the literature, these berserkers too became less heroic as the world moved further and further into Christianity, becoming instead objects of disdain, hatred and fear, uncontrollable in their wildness and killing without discrimination, reinforcing this idea that the old ways were dangerous, and in a word, primitive, through their embrace and acceptance of the wild. Needless to say, this also applies to the Valkyries. Sorry, I'm legally obliged to mention them at every opportunity, with their gradual domestication very much tied hand in hand with this refusal of the wild, stripping their power over time into something more acceptable and gender-conforming to the post-conversion writers and scholars. There's also a pattern of feminine power being tied to the wild, but I'm going to pull a Snorri and just leave that as brain food without explaining things further, in this video at least. Yet in the Nordic world, animals aren't wholly of the wild either. They often possess very human qualities, such as that most foundational of human skills, communication. Islendingasoga and Konungasoga have both horses and dogs showing an understanding of human instruction. In Finnboga Saga, we have a bear who is outlawed through laws that normally apply only to humans, again emphasizing a tendency to treat animals as something not quite wild within the texts themselves. But the bear later also clearly understands and listens to the titular Finnbogi when on the precipice of potential combat. In more than a few instances, we have animals showcasing an ability to engage in spoken language of humans and on a level playing field in terms of intelligence, most commonly with birds. In Hrafnsmal, we have an unnamed Valkyrie speaking to a raven about the deeds of a king, with the raven in the role of information giver, answering the maiden's questions with insight. In Volsunga Saga, Sigurd is able to speak with birds upon slaying Fafnir and tasting his flesh. Similarly, in Guthrun Darkfeather, Guthrun is able to achieve the same thing after partaking in Fafnir's heart. In Helgakfeather Hjortfarsona, it is the son of Earl Atli who understands the speech of a wise-minded bird and desires its knowledge. And the examples go on. In quick summary, animals can take on qualities that would otherwise be strictly reserved as human. They aren't entirely of the world, but also clearly not of the human world either. With all this in mind, animals then are potentially best described as the paragon of liminality in the Viking Age. Not human, but also, as I've just highlighted, not entirely of the wild. Liminality is a huge topic in Old Norse studies, so I'll keep the boundaries of that discussion relatively tight and hone in on the idea that, as detailed by Christina Djenbert in Animals and Humans, Recurrent Symbiosis and Archaeology in Old Norse Religion, animals in the literature are boundary crossing by their very nature, with that theme manifesting in multiple ways. Many academics have also spilled much ink on exploring how the act of bringing animals into the longhouse created a mixed environment of the wilds within the home, all while comparing that to later developments of rejecting the wild. There were a number of papers, either in the works or published, on the subject, which were presented during my attendance of the Norse in the North conference in May. It was excellent. I can go on many a tangent about how amazing that conference was. But anyway, this idea of the wilds and society is a discussion that is constantly moving forwards and developing even right at this moment, which is incredibly cool to see. I would argue that the archetype of this liminality is Ratatoskr, who seems to exist mostly in the spaces between realms. As a messenger, he frequently crosses boundaries that even the gods themselves seem to struggle with, travelling between the canopy and roots of Yggdrasil solely, we can gather, for the simple goal of achieving mischief. There's also the Fylgja, the fetch, follower aspect of the multi-part soul, part that moves beyond us through dreams, manifesting in our world and others, crossing boundaries freely, as do Hugin and Munin, who travel the worlds to bring back information, insight and wisdom to Odin. There is an argument to be made that ravens are Odin's Fylgja, travelling in spaces that would otherwise take significant time and energy to physically travel to. I've also spent some time wondering about why Odin needs Sleipnir, or otherwise uses him, considering we have examples of Odin transforming into animals previously. Apart from one instance, Sleipnir is often mentioned when Odin needs to travel to the world of the dead. Turns out there's quite a wealth of academic studies in connecting horses in burial rites with links to travel to the underworld, especially when it comes to higher status grave sites, which often have several horses, presumably to make sure that the journey has no delays whatsoever. It seems that given their associations with life and fertility, the sacrifice or death of a horse is given even greater meaning. We also see this with knitting poles and the like, perhaps empowering or making the offering more potent due to the vitality and associations of the creature used in the production of such a tool. So, to go back to the question I promised from this video's title, were animals believed to be realm travellers? I would say yes, but that answer must consider a number of smaller questions within that, and includes an obvious caveat. Animals held a special place in the balance between human and what was not human in Viking Age society and beliefs. I think there's no doubt that there was an understanding of the Viking Age people that animals were of the wild, that the wild was a place of magic, an old place that harboured secrets and wisdom of a way of living that society, culture and the greater civilization was gradually moving away from. Magic was tied to a rejection of societal norms, of embracing some of the power of the wild and of the old. There's a sort of natural tension between these two states that I find incredibly fascinating during this time period. Because the Viking Age was a time of swift development, but also of hanging on to old traditions, of the incoming wave of dogmatic religion butting heads with the old ways, of written language against spoken word, of deep wounds from the Dust Veil, and the collapse of the Roman Empire, meeting the supposed enlightenment of new ways that would guide humanity into a brighter future. The migration period was a time of small, localized tribes and war chiefs, the Viking Age of travel and expansion, and the end of the Viking Age of unification, order and settlement, of rural villages and hamlets meeting quickly expanding urban populations. Again, this idea of new versus old. I don't think it's any accident the doom of the gods and the harbingers of Ragnarok are mainly wolves and snakes, not, say, the domesticated animals the Viking Age people would have recognised. They are the wilds coming back with a vengeance, punishment for hubris perhaps, and a warning about trying to dominate the natural world through brute force. It always wins. Wolves, despite being tamed by Odin and the Valkyries, are also archetypal of the wild, ridden by troll women, mothered by women and thrown into the world to devour the sun, the moon and everything in between. Animals are of the wild, but not entirely. And in that, they held a power to cross boundaries of all varieties. Through the Fylgja, they held an understanding of what the future may hold, and could travel into different spaces to give warnings and carry messages, travelling across the boundary of time and the boundary of space. Even the gods took on this power through changing their form and shape, or otherwise used animals to drive their chariots. The berserkers changed their forms to empower and embolden their bodies to achieve things they would not otherwise be able to, but at the cost of crossing societal boundaries, of becoming once more of the wild, to turn away from the moving landscape towards modernity. So where does this leave us heathens, looking at the literature as we do and drawing the conclusions that we draw? Well, as pagans, I see that we are reclaiming the wild piece by piece, and finding a middle ground between our very modern world and the very old world we often look back at wistfully. There's power in that pursuit, wisdom and insight to be gained, or rather, relearned. This isn't going to be a let's just leave the modern world and return to nature / just go outside sort of conclusion, but perhaps a suggestion that crossing boundaries, crossing lines, challenging things is a healthy thing to do. But like all of my videos, my main goal here is to ask questions and to make sure you ask questions of your own beliefs and understanding of the literature and information we do have. There's so much we can learn from just picking things apart and looking at them closely to see where they fit in the larger image. But yeah, I hope I've sparked a thought or two. Happy to do a follow-up if needed. See ya!